All right, so thanks again for joining, and I would like to introduce Dr. Christine Ritchie, who is the Director of the PCRC Investigator Development Center.
Thank you, Sarah. So welcome, everyone. We are so delighted to have you join us for today's webinar, and we are particularly delighted to have Helen Starks teaching with us today. So you can see Helen's academic appointments on the slide in front of you. So I'll tell you a few other things about her that you may not know. Health in communications and health services research, and she has been doing mixed method research in palliative care for over 25 years. She began her career as a research manager with an MPH from UC Berkeley, right across the bay from here. And she, at that point, managed projects on clinician patient family communication, advanced planning, and evaluating patient and family outcomes following palliative care interventions. Her dissertation was about a longitudinal qualitative interview study on patient and family experiences with physician aid in dying in Washington State before it was legal. The first cohort of the PCRC Career Development Awardees in 2007, work for that award focused on analyzing cost savings attributed to inpatient palliative care. She has been teaching qualitative methods for over 10 years, so we can't think of a better person to teach you. And she's trying something new for us by making this a two-part webinar with homework for all of us in between to help make these abstract concepts more concrete. So I think this is going to be a lot of fun, and this is actually sort of a new experiment for us as well. She assured us that everyone can do this no matter your prior experience. So thanks again, Helene, for being a part of our webinar series, and we'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. So, Sarah, what we decided that might be a useful way to start is to sort of get a feel for who is on the call in terms of both professional background and also how familiar you are with qualitative methods. So Sarah has a poll for you, and if you would all just take a few minutes and tick those two boxes. To answer that question, we'll be able to see who's on the call. And then the third question for your email address is for Sarah's benefit so that she can be sure to follow up with everybody so that you can get what's needed for the next webinar. So please a minute. We're done. We will close. So few more, and then Sarah, go ahead and close the poll, and then we'll see who's on the call.
Great, everyone. Another 30 seconds because I can see there's a handful still in progress.
Make sure that you hit that submit button that's down in the lower right corner. Otherwise, it won't go in. Sarah, look.
Let's do it. It's time to what it looks like.
Results yet?
All right, here we go. Everyone should be able to see those results.
Oh, look at that. That's a nice mix of a crowd. It's like many of you are somewhat familiar, so that's really what I was interested in, to try and see where we stand with this. I expect that some of this will be fairly basic, but a lot of it, I hope, will be detailed enough to give you new things. So, Sarah, I have control of this now.
All right, let me switch that over.
But I can't see the slides.
Okay, so we'll need to have you open the slides and share your screen.
Oh, okay, that can do. Sorry. The technical side that makes it tricky. perfectly yesterday. There we go. Share my screen. Sorry, doing what I'm supposed to do. Those. Right. Well, hope you are seeing my screen. Because topics I will cover today.
We can start Excel.
I don't know that it says it's reviewing Rebecca Henderson's.
Oh. Yep, let me switch that over to you.
See my screen that says topics I will cover today?
I don't see that screen.
Your screen once more, Helene.
Okay. Let's see. Share my screen.
There we go. That's
Yep. Looks good.
Okay. Finally. We're going to try to do this in segments because I'm going to cover enough material that I want to have a pause along the way so that people can chime in and ask for clarification as we go. So for the very first piece here, I talk about the strengths of qualitative research methods and when we might use them in the continuum of evidence building. So around your research question, how much do we already know and where might qualitative methods jump in to augment the evidence? And then I also want to talk about different analytic approaches and make sure that you're using the right design to match your research interests. Then jump in and talk about sampling, data collection, data presentation strategies, and a coding and analysis overview. And we'll have another pause after that so that you can ask some questions about that stuff. Then I want to finish with expectations for the next webinar and give you some instructions on what that looks like. And please be sending chat questions at any time. So as I'm covering things, if you have questions, just go ahead and send those to Sarah. She's going to help collate, and then do a pause, we can answer some of those questions. So first, what is the goal of qualitative research and how, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how it's different from quantitative research because these really are never methods that are in opposition with one another, but are almost always complementary. And I think a lot of what we're doing in quantitative research is really focusing on outcomes, but a lot of times we don't have as much information about those processes and what it is we're doing that creates those outcomes, and qualitative research is really great for that. They are terrific for helping us sort of really understand the complexity of things and understand sort of the whole nature of a phenomenon. So we dig around and look at the multiple dimensions of phenomena so that we can both understand better, but then also to generate hypotheses and build theory around those things so we can investigate them further. A lot of times, qualitative methods help us break through assumptions and biases and things that we take for granted. A lot that this is an exploration of the taken for granted because we move through the world with a set of assumptions that we don't always question, and this makes us stop and pause and do that. Lastly, it's super fun. So this is a good way to learn more about things you're interested in. I've seen the evidence pyramid, but I think it's important to remember at all times that we use different methods to correspond to both what is already known and how we can advance knowledge in the field. So the foundation is almost always descriptive work, and qualitative work fits quite nicely into this. But if you want to think about how we learn to define a question, a controlled study or case series report are qualitative, where we are putting a case out there and starting to articulate the parameters of the case so we begin to understand kind of what the drivers We may follow that case series with some more in-depth interviews with people who have similar experiences as that case we first noticed, to start to understand in ways is this a one-off, and in what ways is this representative of something that might be more systematic. As we get into hypothesis testing and further, if we have a good understanding of how to ask a good question, we could be wasting some of our more expensive resources for randomized trials if we don't specify correctly what it is we're testing. And so I want to offer that qualitative research does a lot to help us do that. Similarly, when in the middle of doing some of these RCTs or others, we might want to do a parallel qualitative study to make sure that we're capturing process. So think about work we do to assure fidelity to protocols could be qualitative nature by either observing the practice or asking for stories post hoc to find out what actually happened to produce the outcome that we got. Lots of questions about when you might use qualitative research in the context of perhaps a research program. And this slide comes from Johns Hopkins. I got this slide from Kim Steinhauser at Duke, and as well as many others. She helped me put this together when I presented this earlier this year, a workshop at PCRC. I'll get this cited to you. I just got it this morning. But the idea here is that we often start with qualitative data, and just like I said, to sort of describe our case better and to actually understand what it is that we want to measure. If we create a survey, for example, that has fixed answers, but none of those answers actually represent people's lived experience, they may not be able to give us very good survey data because it just doesn't really align with their experience. Sometimes we might start with qualitative data to inform a survey, and then we can interpret those results. Sometimes we might have a survey that gives us a range of answers that we don't really understand, and so might follow up with survey respondents to ask them more in depth to explain why they answered the way that they did. And that would also then lead to an interpretation of results. You can do this as concurrent designs where you might have your primary study being a quantitative study and may have a qualitative component in it, like I said before, with an RCT where you may be doing qualitative methods to get protocol fidelity. Or the way around, you may have a primarily qualitative data, let's say with a patient with patients with COPD or heart failure, and you might want to ask some quantitative data to be able to use standardized measures that would help us understand the severity of their illness or how much shortness of breath they have or something like that. And the idea here is that you have a fuller picture understanding the circumstances with both kinds of data. Well, on to the actual, what are we going to do? It always is the same old question about how questions drive choices. And the first one is really, where are we in the state of the evidence and what knowledge gap are you trying to fill? The next is really, who cares about this? Who's your audience? When you do a study like this, you probably need to have in mind who might be the consumers of this information. For example, if you're doing a qualitative study about the phenomenon of pain, is your audience trying to reach clinicians, or is your audience trying to reach patients, somebody else? It's useful to be thinking about these things ahead of time because it will shape some of the choices that you make. Lastly, it's really thinking about what kind of a qualitative study is this? Is this a program or a process evaluation where you have a pretty limited outcome that you're looking for? You really want to demonstrate, for example, barriers and facilitators to the implementation of your program, or you want some stories about satisfaction and experience with your program. It's something that might be more theoretical in nature, where you're really trying to understand more complex feelings of how somebody has experienced illness or wellness. Or are you trying to build a theory of action? And part of the reason why these end products are important to think about in the beginning is it may reflect how much work and energy you need to put into this program evaluations and barriers and facilitators are fairly low bars and fairly easy to do, relatively speaking. But these deeper levels of lived experience and theories of action might take more time to complete. This is, throughout this presentation, I'm going to be giving you citations on these slides so that you can look them up. These slides are available to you to follow up with. But this is a diagram from this terrific paper, Justifying Knowledge Method and Taking Action, that talks about epistemologies, which are really theories of knowing. And in this instance, they're really talking about the ways that these epistemology, methodology, and method really interact. So epistemology is really a starting point of where you are. And with qualitative data, there's a lot of worldviews that you might have to begin with. A positivist or post-positivist point of view is really this idea that what you see is what you get in the world, and that there are facts to be found, there are facts to be defined. But in the post-modern world, people talk about realism or social constructionism, which are different epistemological points of view that posit that there isn't really anything fixed in the world, that how we live our lives and understand it is dialogue and interaction with others who bring meaning. So in the Northwest, what the rain might mean to me might be very different than what rain might mean to people who live in Phoenix. And that understanding is through collective dialogue. And these starting points matter because what happens next in terms of to approach your methodology will depend on really how you think about story, how you think about facts, whether you think they are fixed or whether you think they're malleable. That approach then, it has to fit both your research question and also the kinds of data that you might collect. I will state that methodology might be akin in quantitative methods to really thinking about design. So is this a case control study? Is this a randomized trial? For us in qualitative, and I'll talk about this in a second, this might be, is this a grounded theory? Is this a disc analysis? And this idea of methodology here might help people to think about in terms of design. And method is actually the work that you do. So it's the collection, it's what you do with those data, it's how you code them, and how you then go to interpret them. It's a complicated thing, not really easy to express in one slide, so I'm going to try again. This is a paper that I wrote with my colleagues in Trinidad, and in this instance, we were really trying to sort of sort out that up here at the top is methodology. So these, again, are different ways of approaching qualitative data through different philosophies, different goals, and different ways of formulating questions. There is really the methods, and this is kind of hands-on experience. And while the methods may be shared across the methodologies, methodologies really shape the ways in which we're planning to approach these questions, and will have implications, as I'll show you in a minute, in terms of design, in terms of questions, in terms of outcomes and products. So to take that a little further, it's important to sort of think about where these different methodologies come from, because there are disciplinary frames that are applied to the way we think about data. So to give you examples, these are some of the common methodologic approaches: ethnography, phenomenology, grounded theory, discourse analysis, and conversation analysis. And you can see that the questions are actually quite different depending on which of these approaches we take. So ethnography is really understanding about process and how culture shapes interactions and meaning. Phenomenology is really this idea of how do we translate an embodied experience into words. So somebody who doesn't live in this body, my body, can kind of understand what that life is like. So if I talk about bone pain, I have to use words that convey experience to others so you can relate to what's going on. When take it sometimes to the next and try to turn those into numbers, but those numbers have no meaning if we can't anchor it backwards to the actual lived experience and understand those words as a translation of that. It's what a lot of people have heard about, in part because it helps us move forward, and it is a qualitative version of predictive theories. Discourse analysis is another way to sort of look at how the words around us shape our understandings of things. So just as an example, last election, we might have thought about immigration in one way, but now the discourse around immigration has really shifted. And so the whole ways in which rhetoric is applied to concepts can really shape our understandings of things. And a lot of what critical discourse analysis is useful for is actually things like policy analysis, where you're really trying to understand how big picture things are being messaged to promote understanding across audiences. Analysis is a micro version of discourse. Discourse is really happening at the societal level. Conversation analysis is really focusing on usually dyadic or triadic interactions. This is often used in studying, for example, medical encounters, where you're really trying to figure out how the back and forth between physicians and patients, or nurses and patients, or whomever is creating understanding and communication. This last just gives you sort of a sense of what you get from this. I also have a handout that I will circulate on the website that sort of takes it to the next example, so that you would see actual products that would come through. This is a lot. Zipping through this stuff so that I can cover some tactics here, and then hopefully open this up for questions. So the last ones are really talking about methodology, and I want to switch now to articulate that a couple of analytic methods that are really more methods than methodologies. Content analysis is one, and this paper by Shea and Shannon is a genius paper. This is one that I refer everyone to because I think it does an absolutely splendid job of explaining what this is. And there are really three forms of content analysis that, again, depend a little bit on where the state of the knowledge is as you approach your data set. So a conventional content analysis is really sort of going in without too many frames of reference before you dive in. You're really letting the data teach you, because you're a bit of a blank slate here. You really don't exactly know what the phenomenon is all about, and you're letting the people who you're asking about it inform and teach you. Direct content analysis might be when, for example, you have a theory. Let's say you have a theory of nociceptive pain, and you use that theory when you go and interview people to try to get their descriptions of their pain. And as you are analyzing those, you are looking for very, very specific examples of nociceptive pain or concepts related to that. So you are essentially narrowing in on a very specific topic to further and expand your theoretical framework. So both the questions that you might ask for a directed content analysis and the ways in which you might approach looking for those answers may be more targeted than conventional content analysis, which may be more open-ended. Finally, summative content analysis is really when you are using, it's almost like a word count, and it is, for example, let's talk about hope. You might do a summative content analysis where you ask people to describe hope. What you're really looking for is almost a lexicon or a typology of all the different dimensions of hope. You might use a slightly different approach when you're doing the analyses, where a conventional content analysis is more inductive approach, where directive content analysis might be more of a deductive approach, meaning that you are going in with a priori questions and codes, and you're really looking for something very specific. And a summative content analysis analysis might be more a mixed approach where you are both doing some almost quantitative work by counting words, but then also looking at them contextually, both deductively and inductively, to discover underlying meanings, metaphors, and synonyms. So just going to take a break right there. That was a big to get all at once. And open up questions. And looks like the first I have is from Marion Zoldwin, asking, how does content analysis compare with descriptive qualitative methods as described by Standalowski? I would say they are similar insofar as the conventional content analysis, where they are both sort of open approaches, and what you are coming up with at the end is really a description of what the data are telling you. So I'd say those are similar ways. You could read both those papers together and kind of come with the same conclusion. The next question I'm seeing here is, are certain content analysis methods better for certain methods? And does content mean data? Content does mean data, and in a minute I'm going to talk more about sort of what the products of these different methods are. It's important to think about content analysis as a starting point. I will argue in a minute that no matter what else we do as we code, we are parsing data into categories so that we can start to understand concepts better. And that's what I mean by content analysis, is you're breaking that data apart into different concepts. And again, I will share that in a minute. I'll have some examples that might make this a little cleaner. Another question is it necessary to understand all of the theories of knowledge and methodologies before starting a project? I think most of us jump into this, and it's only after we get data that we figure this out, that there are multiple ways to approach the analysis. Argue that knowing something about these different is probably useful to see how your own inquiry might align with some of those, because, for example, if you're really trying to understand how patients experience treatment, for example, let's say, how do they happens to them when they go through chemotherapy, happens to them when they get a massage. You might actually be talking about a phenomenological thing that has to do with how people make meaning in their body. And knowing about that ahead of time might help you ask better questions or think more specifically about what you're trying to learn. And I think a lot of us come into this from a pretty straightforward point of view. I have barriers and facilitators to my program, and I want to know how to get stuff done, in which case maybe that theoretical framing is less important. These tricky questions, because a lot of qualitative is obvious to us, because as clinicians, you all get qualitative data every day in a clinical encounter. You are used to using narratives to elicit information, and you don't always need a theoretical perspective to answer that. So it's a no. I think it really depends on your purpose. Somebody asked, what is a theory of action? And what I would say to that is, a theory of action is, how do you think the world works? We all have back pocket theories of cause and effect. And some of that is just tacit knowledge that we bring to bear based on our own experience of having gone through the world. A theory of action is one in which you formalize that and actually work it through to come up. For example, the theory of reasoned behavior is a theory of action, because it is informing what is necessary to make choices in life, and what are the sorts of behaviors that, once you understand the theory, help us both predict future actions and also make better sense of ones we witness. There's another question here. Characterize template analysis within you've set up here, and I think template analysis is essentially, if I'm understanding this correctly, like a directed content analysis. Not 100% sure I know what a template analysis is, but if I understand that correctly, it is a bit when you are going in with some a priori understandings of how things might go, and you are to fill in the cells in your template. So you might articulate in advance kind of things you're looking for, and in that regard, it might be a directed content analysis that would be the best match for lining that up. I see another question here. I've seen analytic methods used in some studies. Is that advisable? And if so, how can you do that successfully? It's like any mixed method, sort of a lead method and a subordinate method. And so, for example, you may be doing a grounded theory of around end-of-life decision-making. I've seen one, an excellent one on a theory of surrogate decision-making. You might have within your grounded theory some questions that are phenomenological in nature, or discourse analysis in nature, and so you may borrow from each other at the method's point of view, but I argue that you're probably still thinking about an outcome or product of the study that would align with one of the methodologies. That's a little more complicated, but people do mix and match, and these borders are blurry, especially when you consider that we use the same methods for these methodologies. And again, I'll show you what I mean in a minute. Let's see here. Well, I have slides. Yes, indeed, they're already up there. Shaw, hi, Jan. Is telling me that the development of a coding template where summarizes themes identified by the researchers as important in a data set and organizes them in a meaningful and useful manner. So this may also be a bit like thematic coding, which I'm going to get to in a minute. With that, right? About this next set that gets people all the time. To help you understand, I'm going to start about quantitative methods and what those are all about, because where people, and it's useful to understand how they compare. So I want to say that in my understanding of quantitative methods, they are both descriptive, but often we use the more advanced statistical methodologies to be able to get us to prediction inference. And under this bell curve, we are really looking for representation and to make sure that we understand the generalized experience across a range of people. And in this instance, the unit of analysis, the person clinic, and that what we're ultimately interested in is the central tendency as expressed by and standard deviations, so that we sort of understand what the common experience is, as well as a plus minus around that common experience. In the instance of outliers, we worry about how they drive the mean, and we often treat them differently or exclude them so that we can increase the precision of our mean estimate. In qualitative methods, we're really interested in a rich description and understanding of the phenomenon of interest. And purposive sampling to identify people that have direct experience with the phenomenon, because they need to be experts tell us about that phenomenon. And it wouldn't help us to do them sampling with these individuals, because the people that we randomly sample may have no experience and therefore can't really tell us anything about it. the most important thing about this and why people get really worried about our small numbers is that they mistake what the unit of analysis is. And in this instance, it's really a concept, an idea, or an experience. And why we need fewer people is because people can generate a lot of concepts. And so 10 or 12 people may be able to tell us absolutely everything we need to know about the experience that we're interested in. And in this instance, rather than the mean, what we're really trying to understand is what the range is. Because if even with 12 people, including outliers, that means that that is a real experience that somebody somewhere in the world has had. And what we're honestly looking for is not only the mean experience, but what the whole range is, to make sure that as we make conclusions about it, we're being inclusive in our understanding of that experience. So this question I get asked all the time. So how many people do we really need to have in our study? And again, it depends on kind of the goal of the methodology and the purpose of the study. You may do a phenomenology of one, in which case it's a case study, but with that one person, you may have multiple interactions. So a paper that I love and I could send is the story of a woman with disability, and the study was done mostly through email because she had difficulty talking. But I had over 70 exchanges, and it was through that iterative back and forth that the meaning of her acquired disability was explored. And it's dialogic, where sometimes the questions we ask is what probes people to think more deeply and reflect on their experience. And so very, very rich experience through phenomenology that is meant to be very, very deep and complex. People do up to about 10. I heard last week that somebody did a phenomenology with 50 people. For that, you just need a lot more time, because you're going to need to be able to think iteratively and carefully with all those 50 people to get at the phenomenon of interest. Evaluation, you may not need that many, 10 to 20, maybe just enough to get the information that you need. This can be very specific and should be aligned with your product. And it might be that you, as all of these things, you look and you analyze it first to see what you don't know, and then continue either to go back to people you've spoken to before, or expand your sample to include people who may know something that your informants didn't, but it's really important to you to be able to get to your product. For example, I'm doing a program evaluation now that includes administrators, health plan executives, families, and I may start with a few and start to fill up my understanding of the situation, but then learn what I don't know by using this data and going back and expanding to more. The theory does the same thing, where you build a theory as you go, and you start to learn what you know and guess what you don't know, and then continue to sample to fill those things in. And grounded theory, what often happens as your questions change, so rather than having a fixed interview guide that you ask everyone over and over again, as you solidify your understanding of particular aspects of your theory, your questions may shift to ask about things that you don't know. We talk a lot about saturation, and I'll talk about that in a minute. This is another really great paper that talks about how many do you really need, and their answer is about 6 to 12 people, especially if they are all talking about the same phenomenon, because if you share some experience of a phenomenon, what you have to say about that gets covered pretty quickly, and you may only need about 6 people. Saturation actually comes in 2 different kinds. There's saturation at the level of the code, and that might be saying something like blue. How many different colors of blue do you need? But then when you think about a theory, you might be thinking about a theory of color, and one side of that cube might be talking about blue, and all its dimensions, sky blue, navy blue, true blue, teal blue. The other might be talking about pink, and the other might be talking about yellow. You need to kind of understand all of these things put together before you can talk about a theory that has multiple dimensions coming to it. So you very quickly hear code saturation when you talk to somebody about the thing. Tell me what it's like when the sun comes out. You hear that many different things. They'll start to coalesce fairly early. You may not know the meaning of a sunny day until you start to approach it from multiple dimensions. And it's when you have a full grid of what the meaning is that you're getting more on the theoretical side of saturation. Now I'll talk about data collection and primarily the difference between interviews and focus groups. This article by Hermanowitz is kind of hilarious. It's a little tongue-in-cheek. It's a little sexist, I'll warn you. But I think these 25 strategies for studying people in bed, the idea behind this is he's sort of thinking of interviewing like trying to pick somebody up in a bar. And the idea is, how do we build rapport with people to get them to open up and start telling us detailed information that is of interest to us? And I want to say that interviews are amazing and often take you to places that you can imagine. What have is their greatest advantage is the fact that they allow for an in-depth exposition of all kinds of deeply personal and intimate things. They, in the scheme of how do we get the work done, in essence, because you're only dealing with one person, they're easier to schedule. And what I would recommend to all is that you give yourself the option to follow up with people after a first interview. Maybe not immediately, but like with what we said previous slide about theoretical saturation, sometimes it helps to circle back to people you've talked to earlier, because they mentioned something, but you didn't quite understand it until you've had a second or third interview with somebody else, and it's as you begin to understand those other things that you realize this person was hinting at something, but you actually didn't ask them about it. So the opportunity to go back and ask further questions as you learn things can be incredibly valuable. Comes to focus groups, which I think people, and I've seen it, that it's an efficient way to do interviews with multiple people, and I would argue that is a mischaracterization of a focus group. Focus groups come out of marketing, and it was to get an impression. What do we think of Buzzbill? You know, it's this flash, you see something, it's about a reaction. You need a skilled moderator to manage the group process. You'll see there's food on the table. It's in a fairly cheerful environment. These are keys. I do not bring cookies to an individual interview, but I would never show up without food for a focus group. You're trying to create a group ambiance and make this kind of fun and accessible. You're doing this as a one-time only cross-sectional kind of thing, where you're trying to get kind of a hit on a concept. So people use these bookended around interviews. Sometimes you'll do a focus group to see if the questions you want to ask in a one-on-one interview would be an okay thing. So you might ask it after you've done a lot of interviews and have results, and what we want to do is find out if they actually sit well with people. So you can bring them and say, here's what we found, what do you think? Does that ring true for you? The biggest advantage of a focus group that is different from an interview is the dialogue that occurs between the participants and the interaction that happens to them. The goal is to really get towards group think, but that is a bit like my slide on the goal of qualitative analysis. It's not necessarily to get to consensus, but to have people contribute and build on each other's ideas. And you might just get a range of ideas at the end, or depending on the topic, they might all decide something is a shared value or shared idea, and that's okay too, but don't feel like you have to get them there. This, by far and away, one of the most difficult things to do. People have to over-recruit, typically by 50 to 100%, to get the number of people in the room. The ideal group size is somewhere between 6 and 8. Many more, and you have a hard time getting everyone to speak. Fewer than that, you just feels like an effort, and sometimes dwindles down to just one person, in which case your focus group is now a one-on-one interview. So I've seen this a lot where people want to say, I want to have a focus group with physicians. That very rarely happens well, because trying to get people all together in the same room at the same time can turn out to be more than it's really worth in the end. So say that they're both have schedule logistical issues, but really think about the purpose and what kind of data you want before you leap to one or the other. Next, I'll switch towards talking about coding a little bit. This article by Ayers, Kavanaugh, and Knoffel is truly one of my favorites. This is another one that I recommend to everyone, because they sort of take both an analytic frame of what coding is all about, but then they offer 3 different examples of within and across case analysis, and it's just a really great article. Their argument is that the way we start with coding is we get these whole stories. We sit down with people and we talk to them for an hour. And first task then is to both decontextualize their story and then recontextualize that story across individuals. So in the decontextualization process, this is really coding. And this is what we're all used to, where we get a page of text and we start marking it up to take this story and break it down into the concepts. Remember, concepts being our unit of analysis. And so this is really where we are working through to start to break up that story into its constitutive parts. The visualization then, if you've ever used an analytic program like Deduce or Atlas or NVivo or any others that are out there, is we take those codes and we look at them across all the people. So that we rebuild to see how person 1 described their experience of pain, person 2 described their experience of pain, et cetera, and et cetera. And we then take that collection of decontextualized story bits and look at them together to start to build our range of experiences around that. Because in a conversation, we didn't just talk about their experience of pain. We maybe talked to them about who knows how many different things in the course of that interview. We are really trying to also examine how these different ideas both themselves separately, but then together as a sort of central theme and a way to sort of tie it all together into a new narrative that is representative of all of the data that we have. So that we kind of do it multiple times. Nobody ever does this once. These concepts I'm about to present are really sort of the foundations of grounded theory. And we borrow them, and one of the reasons why we really like grounded theory is because it has this sort of rule book. It gives us a set of instructions that seem to make a lot of sense. So the first round is usually some version of open coding, and I like to call that bin sorting, where we're sort of reading through this text, and as we come across different topics of conversation, we start to categorize them by adding tags to them or codes. And then the next round, once we've got our coded data set, is, like I said, we start to extract the body of text associated with each of these codes and start to think about how do they relate to each other? What are the patterns in the data? The third one is when we're sort of trying to synthesize further and further up, so we're getting further and further away from the data and more conceptual and abstract. And one of my students, when I was presenting to, said, wait a minute, this sounds a lot like what we do in univariate, bivariate, and multivariate analysis. And I have to say he was absolutely right. So this round, we're really just trying to describe what's in the data. The task is really trying to figure out what goes with what. And third is really trying to get it to a more synthetic take-home that accounts for all of the data, but reduces it down to a concept that is more abstract and more inclusive, but easier to talk about. So we show you that might look like. This is yet another paper that is one of my favorites. Again, Jennifer Tweed-Sterling is just super clear in articulating the steps for how you go about doing this. You will, each of these basic themes would represent a code. So green on the upper left might be codes on pain management and of well-being. And we might think about how those are all related. And I got that wrong. Maybe what I started as a basic theme as feelings of well-being may actually be an organizing theme about being. And it is iterative. You kind of go back and forth, and sometimes these basic themes put out as single codes end up being the organizing theme, especially as you dig into them even more and sort of both break them apart and then re-put them back together. This is super intuitive to me because I'm doing it for a really long time, but recommend that you think about reading this paper if you're interested, because it really helps to understand how we make sense of those things. But I think you can think that in any instance where we have a global theme, this is like a theory. And these organizing themes and the basic themes that make them up are a bit like variables in a multivariable equation where, for example, this might be demographics, this might be clinical circumstances, and this might be the equivalent of care in a health system, and the global theme might be health. I'm making this up, but these are the sorts of ways that you might approach about the relationships of your data as you code them. For the mechanics of coding, if you have not seen this book, you should. It is really helpful, and it talks about the fact that there is no one way to do coding. There's a lot of different ways to do coding, and he gives a lot of examples about how to do it. And I just borrowed a little bit from his table of contents about different ways to approach things. So, for example, you could use grammatical methods, which would have you pay attention to adjectives, for example, or magnitudes. So let's say you're talking about an examination of you go in and look around. Attributes would be when people say they're hungry. And magnitude might be saying, I'm really, really hungry, or I'm not very hungry, or I haven't been hungry for a week. These are just some examples. I'm not going to go into all of them, but to sort of give you a feel for what these different methods might be like. Pencil methods are really more about looking at the descriptions or the structures. So what is the context of the story, and how are they discussing what that process might look like, or what are the features of a concept. And methods might be reading a story for emotions or values. This coding is when you say, what day versus night? What is love versus hate? What is anger versus happiness? And it's a way to kind of keep flipping your frame of reference. You're going through and using some of these guides almost in a directed content analysis sort of way to help you focus in on specific aspects of the data that you're looking for. The others, it's a lot to cover, but we can talk about this more next time as well if this is of interest. I'm going to use this little example from Alice in Wonderland just to sort of show how coding happens. For those, you probably have done this before, but I just want to give you a quick example. So here, I want to talk about lumpers versus splitters because this is really a way in which you individually approach a text. And what I want to say is there's no right way to do this because it is an iterative process. Lumpers usually split later and splitters usually lump later. So it's really kind of how you approach it the first time. So this few paragraphs, I personally am a lumper, so I'm starting with that. And I tend to take a piece of text and add mul codes to it, and I'll show you in a minute how the reverse is. You have a narrower chunk and one concept for each one. So in this instance, we might just start labeling what's going on in this paragraph, or I did, as concepts related to being boredom, being alone, and thinking about the use of books. Next one is the concept here for me is feeling lazy. I just missed the white rabbit right now because I don't know what to think about White Rabbit, so I'm putting a tag on him because I want to be able later to look and see what everything related to White Rabbit might say. And this is a big chunk for me where there's a lot going on, and just coded the whole thing as surprise, curiosity, impulse, reaction, and turning point. For the others in the group, this will make you crazy because you won't know which parts of this text are associated with each of these codes. So you splitters might approach this a little bit differently. We're doing what in grounded theory might look more like what they call line-by-line coding, where you are making the chunks of text much smaller and assigning very specific codes to those actual lines. Then on the next round, you might have to merge more things. If I were a lumper, I'd have to split more things. So this is also a frame that I use because I know what my software can do for me. And splitters have an advantage that lumpers do not using most of the software because most softwares will allow you to merge codes. So we have tired of sitting alone and feeling sleepy and stupid, maybe things later that we would want to put together and rename with yet another code. And you can do that. But if you were to lump, you would have to double code or triple code things and split them later. I'm not to sort of, once you've sort of coded your data, when you're starting to ask questions about how things get done, if you've never read this paper by Margie Sandalowski, it's truly one of the best I've ever seen. And the 6 C's here actually come from grounded theory. But I always like to use a cube as an idea because in my view, concepts always need to be turned around a little bit and kind of examined from different angles because, you know, usually sort of understanding the bits that we can see, these faces of the cube, but there's always 3 faces of the cube we can't see. So kind of putting our analyses as we go to help us think about, well, what does this really mean? You know, so if I'm thinking about well-being, what are the causes of well-being, or what are the contexts in which well-being happens? What is needed to make well-being possible? And when I feel well, what happens next, et cetera. So these are just tools to sort of continue to push our own assumptions as we begin to draw conclusions or interpretations about our data. And this is a way for us to put our thoughts that as we develop our own kind of working theories about the data, we have ways to be skeptical about them and go back and poke at them a little bit to confirm that we're kind of on the right track. Another thing that is really important to do is memoing. Memoing is really this process of journaling. People say, you want me to write a journal? It's like, yep, that's exactly what I want. Because if we don't keep track of our thinking as we go, our thinking evolves and we can't really say why we came to the conclusions. So in an instance, I think about it, this came actually from the grief spiral, this notion that, when we first have an experience, it's new and we're naive and we're sort of have a bunch of feelings and thoughts about it. But as we go through time, and in this case, perhaps read more data, we're drawing on our prior experiences to make sense of the ones that we encounter afterwards. And the first time we start to write up our data is at the top of this spiral. We really remember when we came to these aha moments along the way because we never wrote it down. So in addition to just help us make sense of our data, it's also really helpful because you may not be able to share your data, raw data with all of your investigator team, but share your memos. And that would be a way for people to sort of get inside your head and understand what you're thinking. It also creates this audit trail so that you can work backwards and realize, oh, whoops, I actually think I made a misinterpretation back there. And now let me rethink this and kind of go through this again. If this project actually makes sense and endures over time, or if it is the thing that, for example, in theoretical saturation is where it helps you to see what parts you understand and what parts seem to be missing, and might be the way in which you decide now that you need to go and recruit some new people so that you can complete that or just a conclusion for where you're coming to. This paper by Burks, Chapman, and Francis is really helpful to sort of understand what it does, and it can be useful. At not least, I want to say that if you are really good about writing memos, your paper will almost write itself because doing all your thinking and you're really starting to synthesize your data and start to get your take-homes as you're going through. And you can almost always, if you've done good memo writing, write a paper from your memos. Some say your memos become your new analytic data set. And I think if you do it religiously, it's probably true. So just to give you an example of this for us. So on the left-hand side is our original data that I had already coded twice for you as a lumper and a splitter. And now this might be a memo, and I'm really just writing this to myself, but it might be also something that I would share my team to sort of give them a snapshot of what I understand about this story. So this is just my way of doing it. Lots of people might do it other ways. Sometimes people have outlines so that they ask themselves a set of questions, and so they standardize it in that way. I'm more of an abstract thinker, so I like to just kind of write free writes. So I say here, we meet Alice as she sits with her sister looking for something to do. She contemplates what to do next. The white rabbit appears muttering to himself. Alice does a double take. First, that a rabbit speaks and acts like a person, and then the curious nature of what he's talking about. So for me, it's sort of a synthesis of the story. And she jumped to follow the rabbit and without thinking, jumps down the rabbit hole. I call this as a turning point because of the phrase, never once considering how in the world she was to get out again, language that foreshadows consequences. In this case, I'm not communicating her actions, but I'm saying something here about why I coded this as I did and what that means to me from a conceptual point of view. So now I'm thinking about the power of the last sentence as both explaining background, but also, pointing to where this story is going next. And that's what I want to do here is just because I realize in all this, the work done, nobody ever talks about data presentation, so I thought I'd try that here, including some from real papers, this one from Park et al., which is a paper that Laura Hansen's group worked on, of parenting while living with advanced cancer. And I think this is really nice for us. We always say, go find an example of the paper that really works for you, and I think this one does that. Just in terms of the results section, they start with an overview to orient the reader to the major themes. And I think for people who are used to reading quantitative papers where they cut to the paper, or to the tables for the data, this is sort of an equivalent. You're letting your audience know what they're going to find in this section of the results. And it is short, sweet, and almost like a table of contents to what the whole results section is going to look like. And it just helps your readers understand kind of what the whole story is before you break it down into its themes or parts. Is in the actual text, the thing that is what makes really good qualitative work from work that we're all a little ho-hum about is when the language, before you get into the quotes, is really kind of synthesizing the take-home messages. And in here, you will see what I refer to as the range. So in this sentence here, these concerns include these, etc. But far more commonly, they were concerned about this. They were also worried about death and how that could harm their children and the quality of parenting. And so what you've done here is you've sort of articulated what the range of experiences are. So going back to my diagram, you're saying on this code of concerns about illness and death of their children was a range of things that people talked about. And when you're trying to tell people these are the things to listen for, as you talk to parents about their advanced cancer, trying to communicate that to their children, these are the kinds of things that they worry about. It's not to say this is what will happen for everyone, but these would be the normal kinds of things we would be looking for. And you, as a clinician reading this paper, may want to ask about these kind of worries, for example. But because these take-homes are somewhat abstract, the quotes really then drive it home and make it real and make it really concrete and visceral. And this sort of organization is very typical, but also very compelling, and it really works, and that's why we do it. But it is by no means the only way to do it. Another way that I've seen done, this is a great paper by Steve Duca and colleagues. For example, their themes, the table. So this is a theme about apprehensions, and in the text, they're kind of that same thing where they're discussing what kinds of apprehensions people had as physicians who were receiving requests for aid in dying. But then they used a table. So instead of having all of this in the text, the table that had a sample of quotes so that you could sort of see the range there. And you get, this is actually a trick people use to get around the word count, because sometimes they don't count the words in a table. And so if you really want to demonstrate a range of quotes and not just have one quote because you think this is worthy of multiple use, this is another way to communicate that data. Another way to do it, and these are not mutually exclusive, are to use diagrams as a way to help communicate your shot of what the totality of the data are. So this is from a paper that I did. This is one of my dissertation papers. And, it's kind of the take-home for each of my themes, and my themes were related to what were the reasons why people decided to go ahead with hastened death given their estimated prognosis. And you can see that depending on where they were on the trajectory in terms of expected life remaining, they had different reasons. So I would have this almost as the snapshot take-home, and in the text, I had explanations for each of these. So these would be dying and done, dying not fast enough, looming crisis, not recognized by others as dying, but suffering just the same, as kind of my themes. And this is a way to sort of put it all together and show the picture all together. So once again, open the floor to questions. And now I don't know what time it is. We have about a half an hour left.
The remaining 20 minutes, feel free to send questions to either Dr. Starks or to me, Sarah Garrigues. The first question that came in is, do you have any suggestions for readings regarding data presentation as you discussed?
Yeah, I don't. I have not seen, I'm not sure about this, but I guess it's because I've just read a lot of qualitative studies. So when I look around, these three approaches are the ones that I see the most. But when you get into methodology books, they're usually more at the level of a book than a paper per se. They'll talk about the sort of outputs that you might get from these different approaches. So grounded theory being a theory, they're really fond of diagrams because they're really wanting you to demonstrate in pictorial form the relationships of the concepts to each other. Thematic analyses, which is really more where the majority of journal articles end up being, in part because of the restrictions on word counts. I've seen the first and second approaches as common ways of doing it. So I think the advice that people always get is looking around for an example, certainly in a journal, if you have a journal audience in mind. A trick I use is to go to PubMed or just go to Google Scholar and put in a journal title and the keyword qualitative and just see what comes back. And two things. You know, the date on the most recent qualitative article will tell you how receptive the journal is to publishing your work in the base case. But then you can go and look at those most recent articles or the whole collection of them if there's not that many, and just look to see what techniques people are using in that particular journal, because a bit of a tried and true, the fact they got published.
Next listener question is, in your last diagram, the line fit in. This understood all but the line, she says.
Let me go back to my diagram, if I can. Come on. So the line here was meant to show the trajectory of illness, and time as the terminal decline. So this line would be with more than 6 months to live, 1 to 6 months to live, 1 to 4 weeks to live, and less than 1 week to live.
The next question is it necessary to standardize coding? This person says they can see how there can be a lot of variability between how people interpret the data in coding. And if so, how do you do this? Multiple people do the coding.
So this whole question about inter-rater reliability in coding is a pet peeve of mine, I'll be honest. Off this picture because you guys don't need to see that. So what I would say is that I do recommend that people code in groups, but not because it means that we're going to cap a statistic of point whatever, 8, 9, whatever. That could be useful. It's important to understand the goal of what we're trying to do. So a kappa statistic is measuring the degree to which two raters are accurately identifying a phenomenon. So mammogram, for example, we have two radiologists reading it, and inter-rater reliability is that the two have identified a lump, something that looks suspicious. The reason why they can have a kappa statistic is because there's an a priori standard against which these two raters are working. So there's some expert panel that says on this particular mammogram, we identify, the code of the experts said there's a spot in the upper left quadrant. And so the question is whether these two other radiologists found that, yes or no. And then when you have something that's well defined before you go in and start your coding process, but a lot of what we're doing in quality, and that work, for example, in a directed content analysis where you are starting with exactly that. You have a well-defined concept and you're going to look for its prevalence in your data set. In that instance, a kappa statistic might work. But time that's not what we're doing, and most of the time when we're having multiple coders look at a data set, it's to do a couple of things. First, to learn how to define our codes by ways in which they are applied. So they are really just tags and labels for things, and we view the concept that we've tagged differently because of our own prior experiences, because of our disciplines, because of just what last week that shapes our thinking about this today. So when we do multiple coders on a transcript, for example, the goal is developing the shared mental model about what these codes mean. And it's developing rules, especially for lumpers and splitters, so that you can see if you're actually capturing the data the way you would want to see it when it gets excerpted out for the next part of coding. So I have this experience where what you end up with is not necessarily a change in what has been coded on the page, but evolving definition of what the codes mean. So going back to my example here, I have a code here that I've called self-reflection. In this instance, it was a couple of one-liners, so she was considering in her own mind. And then this is a bigger paragraph about self-reflection. It's a way of making sense about, there wasn't anything so very remarkable in that, so she's actually thinking back on her thinking. And I might sit down and have called that self-reflection. Somebody else might have coded these two things really differently. But so we look at, I called that self-reflection, somebody else called it something else. So we get together and then we start to do a little bit of a meta exchange where we are each other how we think. This is very much like any interdisciplinary process where what we can consensus on is how we approach the data and how we name it in a coding book. What I often talk about is that iterative processes are really important to start, especially at the beginning, because what you're trying to do is create a shared mental model about how you're approaching coding. And in this instance, you can get a kappa close to 1 because what actually happens is that over time you're training each other to think along similar lines, not only in terms of how you tag the data, but how you're likely to use the data later when you are trying to do the abstraction from a basic code to a basic theme, to an organizing theme, to a global theme. And so we don't see each other that we're sort of approaching this data from simulations in order for us to make sense of the data later. So anyways, I think that it's about accuracy so much as about comprehensiveness. And what I really love about doing coding in teams is that somebody always helps me recognize my blind spots by asking me to explain why I did what I did. It's often in the course of the conversation that we are building our shared understanding of our code book and what code means. So if you're either doing this on paper or you're using a software program where there are ways to annotate your definitions. And make sense of the code book. And what it means is I always recommend start with a definition, and then as you code and you use that code, often instead of adding more codes, what you might want to do is consider expanding the definition of a smaller number of codes so you have more fitting into that umbrella. What it does is it helps you to create your cube inside code as opposed to having 6 codes that then you lump together as a cube, if that makes sense.
The next question is, do journals expect inter-rate reliability or CAPA scores?
It depends on the journal. I try to now write in such a way that I avoid discussing print agreement. I step that all together. And what I usually say is something like, this is an iterative process that team coded independently and then came together to review codes. And through that process, refine definitions of the code and discuss I'm trying to think what the thing resolve differences and come to consensus about the coding process. So emphasize consensus over agreement. And I have found that if you are transparent about talking about your process, you avoid using the word agreement, you can avoid getting into CAPAs. But I made the mistake once where we had talked about agreement between coders, and then the journal editor threatened to just not publish the paper at all until we gave him a CAPA. So to kind of go backwards and make something up, but to be honest, it wasn't very good, because at the end of the day, your agreement is going to be good, not because you had some rigorous process, but because you taught each other to get to the point where you will agree about these things, and your disagreements are nuance that kind of makes sense because it's a diagnostic test. It's an interpretive process. So, use words like inductive, iterative, consensus are smarter ways to go about getting this to sail through without any eyebrows or requests for CAPAs.
Okay, next question that came in says, I recently did some thematic coding. There were some ideas that only one person may have mentioned. Can I use that data since it wasn't an overall theme among a majority of the interviewees?
In fact, I would say that oftentimes players that make the conversation more interesting. So you will always find a mean insofar as there's an answer that lots of people give. If that were all you were to report, I would anticipate that you might get a reaction from your audience that's kind of, well, sure, of course, duh, we already know that. And in part because when you're talking about a phenomenon that people are familiar with, they're going to be familiar with the common experience. In this case, it's really important to remember that frequency doesn't really convey importance necessarily. I mean, most common response may be the most important response, but it may also be what most people already know. And so the value of this is to never reject an outlier or a one-off. It might be that somebody just volunteered something that was so unexpected, and that in fact is what is worth illuminating to your audience, because it's not the story they will have heard. So a way to do that, if you are not finished with your data collection, is to integrate those surprise ideas or those one-offs as a pointed question that you might introduce in future interviews if you're still collecting data. This is another reason why it's super important to not wait until you're all done with data collection before you start to analyze your stuff, because you might find that this is actually a common experience, but it's not something people talk about unless they're prompted. Remember, the goal here is not about frequency, because really not, we won't know because we allow people to just sort of tell us their stories without structuring it to thematically evaluate whether this is an experience people have had and in what ways have they had it, but to let people tell us their stories and try to make sense of those stories across a group of people and their stories. That these one-offs are things that if you integrated it into a survey in the next, you'd find out that it's actually very common. It's just that nobody ever thought to ask about it. So absolutely, it's your outliers.
Great. We'd like to, if we could skip forward to the assignment so that we can make sure we give everyone enough information about what we're hoping to do next month. And then in the next slide, there's going to be a link where we are asking you to submit any future questions so that Dr. Starks can answer all of those questions on the next webinar.
So what I'm going to be giving you guys, and some of you who have worked with me before have done this, I am giving you a 4-page excerpt from Frederick Douglass's autobiography. So he was a slave, if you don't remember him. And it is a short excerpt from his autobiography that talks about a particular aspect of his life. I love this because it's not anything any of us think about for work, and yet it is a really compelling narrative. So it works really well for this exercise. So I'd say start by printing a copy because there's really something tangible about relieving yourself of the constraints of a computer. And then the hardest thing is to approach this with a pen in your hands. We're always wanting to jump in and start coding right off the bat. But one of my advisors said that what happens then is we are anticipating the story before we even know it. So better to give yourself time to actually read the whole story and then a second pass through. Another mentor of mine said, we really need to hear a story 8 times before we make any sense of it. And so if you start to parse it before you've even given it a chance to breathe its full air, then you're really getting ahead of yourself. And this sort of makes sense if on an interview, because in that instance, you've already heard the story once. And by the time you get a transcript in front of you, it's not the first time. But if this is new text to you, you always want to read it before you start coding so that you sort of know the end of the story before you get started. And 3 will be to go back to it now, ready to start to highlight, underline, bracket, however you section out your sections of text, be a lumper or a splitter, into your meaning unit. In a splitter, you'll probably have one code for that text. If you're a lumper, you may have several. And so start to assign those and just write, free on this on the slide. When you're done going through those 4, I want you to write a memo because this is really the beginning of analysis. You start to write your first memo. So what you want to do is try to write a synthetic, a little bit, maybe like the way I did. Yours come out who you are and what you're thinking about, but also a chance for you to start to know. So, aspects of this story are really catching your attention and why. And I'm in the instructions that are coming, I'm sending you 2 pages. The first is essentially this open coding way of doing it, and I've articulated all of these instructions again in that first page. And I ask you to do that before you open the Part 2 instructions, because the Part 2 instructions are going to be a bit like a directed coding exercise where I give you or I ask you to select a particular frame. And I'm doing that because I want you to notice the difference between what happens when you approach a text without any preconceived ideas about what you're going to find versus you read that very same text when you're given a frame to approach it through. And it's an important exercise because it gives you a way to understand how bias does enter into this. And in this instance, I want to articulate that in qualitative work, this is really about perspective. It doesn't mean error. It means way of approaching the data. And this is an exercise to sort of help you difference between those two. And they've also given you a link to a Catalyst survey. It's like it's just a survey tool, and it's just open-ended. And the box looks limited, but you can write forever. You can ask me as many questions as you want, or provide comments as you wish. The idea was that, like this chat, we would have a whole series of questions, and then I'm going to do my own thematic analysis and kind of group them and see if it looks like there might be some benefit from a quick topic, but really most of the next round will be a Q&A that is much more interactive, I hope. So I hope that's all we're hoping for. This is the all that good stuff. So if you go back to the PCRC website, you'll find a spot that has a link to the homework and the survey where you can submit questions. Thank you. I really appreciate you all taking time to be with us this afternoon, and I look forward to talking to you again in a month.
Thanks so much, Dr. Starks, and thank you for everyone who joined us today. If you did not have a chance to submit your email address in the poll earlier at the beginning, please do so now, and I will make sure to send out the coding exercise, or you may find all the instructions on our website, which should be showing on your screen. But thank you all, and we talk to you in another